Debate, what we saw happen was something unfortunate. We saw a side of the House that lost sight of what its burden was. And this burden ultimately was to show us that cutting diplomatic ties with these countries would result in real change in the circumstances of LGBT people in those countries. And this is something that they really couldn't clash with us on, and something that they really didn't deal with and didn't show us. And on those grounds purely, we argue that the opposition, or the proposition rather, has lost this motion. What we heard fundamentally were 4 points. Firstly, this idea that we'd be protecting people in our country, that we have an obligation to protect these people in our country using the Constitution. Thirdly, that we'd be protecting others. And lastly, how this would actually enact change within moderate countries. Now those are the four main points that we really had. What we didn't really feel was any engagement to any of our positive matter, any of the issues that we raised up, right? No one really clashed with whether or not, or the reasons we brought up for why people would never really buy into this situation. But nevertheless, let me continue, right? So, in this first instance, from the first speaker, what we heard is that principle is very important. Principle is that which we must fight for to the very end, even if it really doesn't result in any real change. By the third speaker, we heard something radical. We heard something like, look, we don't like it when homosexual people get killed, but if people get killed because their government starve them, because we apply pressure on them, then so be it. The fundamental flaw that was their principle. Ultimately, we argue that if the principle doesn't really enact any real change, if in fact it incurs more harm to people on a mass scale, if it incurs more harm to people, including LGBT and broader society and the development of African countries, that we should reconsider it. But none of these issues were really dealt with. They didn't really deal with the idea that socially and politically that we would be compromising our position as a body that is able to enact change within organizations like the African Union, in places where change and reform is desperately needed in those countries, where we're desperately needed to be the ones who are voice of reason and peace and justice in countries that have nothing of the sort. We really didn't have any engagement on that. We felt that this was a very important issue because it impacts homosexuals as well as broader African society and the development of that society. We made the point that ultimately the basic needs of people in terms of economic sanctions and how those would impact society was something that we should really consider. That firstly, would South Africans be willing to buy into that notion that they should sacrifice themselves for governments who are unwilling and unshifting in their positions? And lastly, whether or not we'd be even able to help Africa on a broader scale to meet its basic needs, let alone the philosophical needs of having a government that understands why homosexual rights are important. But moreover, they chose to live in this fairy tale world where they didn't really understand what influences law, that law is influenced by the perceptions of society. And as long as your judges and your officers and your enforcers of that law are still opposed to you, still think that you're disgusting, still think of you as an abomination, you will never have recourse within that country. You will never be able to be safe within that country. What we wanted was to initiate a positive and long-lasting change, a change that can only be initiated through development in education, a change that can only be initiated from a stance of a good relationship and good diplomatic ties, that as an enemy you can do nothing but be seen as a threat, as someone who is always wrong, that as a friend you can do more, that you can influence change. And for those reasons, we as a Proposition House will not beg to oppose, we are proud to propose.